This video will take us through some examples of translating trig functions. So our objective is I can translate trig graphs. And what I want you to point out that the A in the amplitude of this still does the same thing. It still changes the distance from the midline of a sine or cosine. Whatever number that is, it changes it from 1 to that number. And the number in front of the x still changes or affects the period. But what we're going to do is we're going to move things vertically up and down with the number in front is where I'll put it. It could be listed at the end of it after the parentheses. And also something inside the parentheses that will move it side to side. Just a big point to make with the horizontal phase shift that it moves it in the opposite direction. Okay, let's take a look now. So looking at a problem like this, we still have an amplitude on this one equal to 3. We have a period. When we look at this, we're going to take, and I'm going to do this in radians. So I'm going to take 2 pi divided by a half, and that's going to be 2 pi times 2, which is 4 pi, is now going to be my period for this trig graph. Now, this number in front moves the whole graph up or down. So what I'm going to do is that number, I'm going to set up a new midline to the graph. So I'm going to go up 2 units, do a dotted line right there. This is my new midline of the graph instead of being the axis. And then this amplitude is going to take it 3 units above. So it's going to take it all the way up to 5 and 3 units below all the way down to -1. This number here moves it in the side-to-side direction in the opposite of what we have there. So since it's minus pi, it's going to move the starting point out to pi here for my graph. So it's going to technically start right here. If you want to draw a new axis, it is not part of the graph, but that's where we're going to start the graph. All right, now what we will do here is I'm going to go ahead and mark out here where my points are. So typically my graph for sine goes from the middle to the top, to the middle, to the bottom, which is down here at -1, and then back to the middle again. So the graph of sine will look like this for one period. Now what I want to do is find the key points here. So I know this one is pi. I know my period is 4 pi, so I'm going to move this out here. This will be 5 pi where my end of my graph is. And now I start having to put the middle points. So when I split this in half, remember one way to do it is to average these two. So I'm going to take 5 pi plus pi and get 6 pi. Divide by 2 will be a 3 pi. And then I'm going to average these two, add 3 pi to pi, I get 4 pi. And divide it in 2, I get 2 pi. Well, it looks like I'm going by pi, so 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, that would take me out to 4 pi. Now notice I'm labeling the axis, not the new midline. That's important just because we label the axis to show what units we're going by. All right, let's look at the cosine graph here. This 6 means I'm going to move the graph up 6 units. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is my new midline for the graph at 6. My cosine will go, since now this is important. That number has not been factored out yet. So before we figure out, I'm going to still have an amplitude equal to 1. But before I figure out what the period is, I've got to factor out a 2. So I'm going to make this y equals 6 plus cosine of 2 times x minus 45 degrees. So that means that this 2 is going to affect the period. My period will be 2 pi divided by 2, which makes it just pi. And then this is, it's moving at 45 degrees. Since it says degrees there, and this one said pi, I was going to do radians. This one says degrees, I'm going to do this one in degrees. I'm going to move it a positive 45 degrees. So here's 45 degrees. I'll move that here. Now I need to go back. I said my period was pi. but since it's in degrees, I'm going to take 360 and divide by that 2. My period's going to be 180 degrees instead. So I'm going to go one full period past it. 180 plus 45 will give me 225 for my end of my period. All right, and now I'm going to go 1 unit above, so up to 7, 1 unit below, which is down to 5. And let's just map out where my cosine would go. So it starts up at the top of the amplitude. It then goes through the middle of the graph. It then goes through the bottom of the amplitude, through the middle of the graph, and ends at the top. So I've got this point here. Let's move this one over just a little bit here. Here, here. And so halfway between 225 and 45, if we add these two together, we're going to get 270. Halfway between that is 135. Add 45 to 135, and I'm going to get, let's see, that'll be 180. And so halfway between those is 90 degrees. Looks like I'm going by 45, so 45 added on to this. If I add 45 onto 135, I'll get 180. And so my graph will just look like this. For that. Notice I labeled the axis even though my midline's been moved up. All right, and lastly, let's do the tangent graph. Remember that our standard tangent graph, since this one has a pi in it, I'm going to say has a period of pi for radians. This -4 is going to move the midline down 4 units, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to start here. This pi over 3, now I want to go in the opposite direction, so it's going to move my middle of the graph over to negative pi over 3. Let's just do a new axis there. So this is kind of where the middle of the graph is. Now, if you recall, tangent has one asymptote to the left of the starting point and one to the right. So what I need to do, I'm going to look at this and say my period has not changed, so it's still going to be pi. So I'm going to go one period that direction is to subtract pi over 2 from pi over 3. So I'm going to go negative pi over 3 minus pi over 2. That's going to be negative 2 pi over 6 minus 3 pi over 6. That gives me negative 5 pi over 6. So that's where my asymptote will go here, is negative 5 pi over 6. And then I want to go 1 in the positive direction. So I'm going to take negative pi over 3, and I'm going to add pi over 2. Well, it's just taking these values and making this one positive. So negative 2 pi over 6 plus 3 pi over 6 will give me a positive pi over 6. So I'll have my other asymptote here at pi over 6. And now I draw my tangent graph, which you recall starts down, goes through the new middle of the graph, and then goes up and starts crossing over toward that other asymptote. So just a reminder, the things that influence phase shift, which is the horizontal movement of the graph, and vertical translation, the one on the outside here being added or subtracted, that moves it up or down. If it's positive, moves it up, negative moves it down. Change where the midline is to help represent that. And the one on the inside of the parentheses, and you might have to factor something out in order to make sure you've got it in the right form. The number inside there, you move in the opposite direction. So if it's a negative, you move it in the positive direction. If it's positive, you move it in the negative direction. Once you translate the graph, then use those new axes, the new midline and the new axis, in order to find your key points and draw your graph.